Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and welcome to Reality Asserts Itself. At the age of 26 years old, Bill Curry ran and won election to state senator in Connecticut. He ran for governor and almost won, which came very close, and later worked in the Clinton White House for a couple of years, working directly with Bill Clinton on his policy. Now joining us to talk about the Democratic Party from a rather unique angle, an insider's angle, I would say, is Bill Curry. He's a columnist for Salon.com and the Daily Beast. He was also, as I said, a White House counselor to President Bill Clinton, and often on the Real News. Thanks very much for joining us, Bill.
Great to be with you again, Paul.
So, in Reality Asserts Itself, we usually start with a biographical story and then we move on to other issues. But here we're going to kind of reverse it a bit. We're going to start with some contemporary stuff, and then the next segment get more biographical. And I want to talk about and hear what you have to think about the Democratic Party's strategy of making such an issue out of the Russia connection. If everything that's being said about the Russians is true, and we don't know whether it's true. There's a lot of assumptions being made about what the Russians did or didn't do, and we're mostly being told to rely on intelligence agencies without a heck of a lot of evidence being put into the public sphere. But even if one assumes most of it's actually true, it seems it's kind of the worst the Russians did is hack the DNC and give this to Wikipedia. And I got to say, there's a lot of theories and some evidence that it wasn't the Russians, but I'm saying for the sake of argument, if the DNC hadn't been up to such nefarious activities, trying to sabotage the Sanders campaign, this wouldn't have been such a big deal. Comey wouldn't have had something to release for the second time. In other words, the interference is certainly, not good. It's kind of silly, though, the Americans crying about interference in elections, because it's beyond imagination how many elections the Americans interfere in. In fact, it's barely imaginable that there's a single election that takes place anywhere in the world that the Americans don't try to influence the outcome. But all that being said, the Democratic Party is feeding this Russophobia that serves, the military-industrial complex, who need a big existential threat in order to justify aircraft carriers and a whole new nuclear weapons program. I mean, weapons on such a scale you could never use it for fighting an ISIS-type fight. What do you think of that strategy? Because it seems to me there's so much focus on that. There's not much focus on the horrible things the Trump-Pence administration is doing on every other front, including foreign policy.
Well, I have two different sort of somewhat conflicting lines of thinking about this. For the first of which, I would somewhat disagree with you. And I talk to my progressive friends every day who cite the things you've cited, how many elections we've meddled in, and not just meddled, we've deposed democratically elected leaders in Chile and in Iran to our own great detriment, and all over the world, our bends in Guatemala. It's an endless story, and we'd be better off if the American people knew more about it. And it would be a great collateral benefit of the current situation if we took the time to teach ourselves not only what we did, but what came of it, all the ill that came of it, how often it backfired against us, even apart from the takings of human life and the violations of international law that were entailed in these intrusions. And so if America learned just the basic principle that people should stay out of each other's elections, that would be a great thing. But that doesn't stop me from resenting this, nor does it stop me from seeing that this really did matter. Between Comey and Putin, I think they did elect Trump. I think that the overwhelming likelihood is that those interventions made enough of a difference, put the American people in the position of thinking that Hillary's election would trigger endless special prosecutors, when in fact it's Trump's that would do that and is doing it. The first problem that people, I think progressives have, is the history I just talked about. And the second problem is that the Democratic establishment, and on this line I very much do agree with what I assume to be the premise of your question. The Democratic establishment, as it still continues to be personified by Hillary herself, uses this as an excuse for all the things it did wrong. Hillary comes out and cites Comey, Putin, and misogyny as the reason she lost. And in fact, this election, no Democrat should have been within hailing distance, within stealing distance of Donald Trump, who's a narcissistic psychological wreck, a complete fraud, and by all textbook definitions, a fascist. And so the Democratic Party has not undertaken this debate within itself. Before the election, people said that whoever lost would have a tremendous internal debate over first premises and core values. We lost, and we're not having that debate. And so there's a piece where you don't want to scapegoat the Comey Putin stuff for a loss that you need to take responsibility for. But at the same time, I do think that what happened is horrible, and I think that action needs to be taken. I don't think that Trump was legitimately elected president, and the fact that that happens all over the world and that it's often our fault doesn't alter my thinking about that.
Yeah, but there's one. I mean, you can debate whether it made a difference to the actual outcome of the election. I highly doubt it, given that Clinton won the popular vote. It shouldn't just been in a few swing states that it made such a difference. Clearly, the Trump campaign targeted these swing states, and Clinton didn't target them properly or nearly enough. And I also think, I don't know of any Democrat that was a defender of the last 8 years, a defender of the Obama administration, a defender of the status quo. If that's the primary message, and that was Hillary's message is, I'm going to continue the legacy of the Obama campaign, build on its achievements. How do you say that in Rust Belt states where people are suffering from policies that we know led to, what was it, something like 90% or so of the post-07-08 crash rise in income, 90% of that increase in income went to 1% of the population. We know that the crisis was handled so much in favor of Wall Street and so on and so on, and everybody's heard these arguments. You can't go out and win an election based on that in states that are suffering so much. And that's far more significant than the Comey thing. I'm not saying it didn't have an effect, but there's, for a whole lot of reasons, it certainly wasn't the primary issue, not the least of which I think most people in this country don't pay all that much attention to these kinds of things. But what I'm saying is there's something more than that, which is the Russophobia, the idea of trying to have a new Cold War, the constant use of the word when talking about Russia as our adversary. I mean, why is Russia, quote unquote, our adversary? Why isn't Germany our adversary? They just need an adversary. Yeah, they don't like a big country with a fairly big economy, nuclear weapons, that doesn't do what it's told. They don't like that, has a different strategy on Syria and so on and so on. But describe it in Cold War terms, and the Democratic Party driving this, that seems not a very constructive strategy, especially if you want people to understand what's really wrong with the Trump administration.
Let me just point out a couple things, and again, I agree with much that you said, but note that the people who are pushing a $54 billion increase in our defense budget right now aren't citing the Russians as their adversary. And consider that a threat of terrorism and our problems arising out of the Middle East, out of our own actions in the Middle East, I would add, or discuss in probably another interview, by and large, that's a plenty of a dangerous other, a dangerous foreign other for people to gin up all kinds of emotions in the American electorate. So I don't think that, I don't think anybody thinks they need the Russians to do that. I do believe that Putin, again, partly because it took our advice. This isn't like the Cold War. It's not a communist state. It's a fascist state. And it's a fascist state because they did what we told them to do. We sent American and British advisors in there during the fall of Gorbachev and in the Yeltsin years. And we told them, deregulate everything immediately, privatize everything immediately, and cut your social contract down to bare bones austerity. And that will promote growth and social progress. What it promoted instead was the development of the largest mafia the world has ever seen, the most extraordinary criminal cartel that has ever arisen. And that criminal cartel is a part of the governing coalition of the country. It's why Russian banknotes can't be taken regular commerce in other countries. They've corrupted this country to the core. We should have a lot of problems with Russia. We should have a lot of problems with Russia. They're not of the traditional kind that you're describing, and we should be approaching them in a different way. To me, I'm not concerned about Democrats saying that Russia's interfered in this election and ought to be held to account. I'm worried about two things. One, what they don't say about the bigger reasons that they lost, and I agree with you foursquare on that. There were things the Democratic Party did, that Clinton did, that it's been doing for years that cost it far more votes. And the second thing on the national security front is it would be nice to have some Democrats say what Ronald Reagan said in the last speech of his life, which is that you have to have multilateral decision making. You have to strengthen the United Nations. You can't be going around the world with all your six guns blazing forever with this ceaseless strategy of unilateral military interventionism. That our safety really resides in the rule of law rather than the force of arms. And the fact that we can't get anyone to question, to point out that one of the many lessons of the last decade and a half in the Middle East is that these standing armies are of no use against any kind of enemy at this point. We're funding dinosaurs at the expense of people in America right now.
Right.
That's a tragedy.
Now,
so there are other ways to approach this, but in the end, I'm just saying when the smoke clears, I'm still upset about this election, and I still think that in an election that close, an intervention that big probably did make a difference. But in any case, I want whoever did it to be caught and punished.
Okay, I think
Lock them up.
using language like calling Russia a fascist state, like to me that's inflammatory. Do you consider the American state fascist?
No, I don't.
Why not?
I consider Trump very few people uses the word openly about him, let alone the rest of the country. But
no, but hang on for a second.
When you murder
Bill, hang on for a second. You know, when we talk about Hitler as a fascist state, part of the issue is the domestic repression and the scale of it, and certainly the scale of Hitlerite domestic repression. You can't compare what's going on in Russia, and clearly Russia is an authoritarian state, but it has a veneer of democracy, a veneer of elections, and yes, they get manipulated and so on. But that's true in the United States as well. And if you look at the foreign footprint of a Hitler, which is a part of that fascism, the foreign footprint of the United States is far more aggressive, has killed far more people than anything the Russians have done. And I'm not here to, like, as some people in this debate are doing, you know, talking some glowing pink rose-colored glasses about Putin and Russia. It's a very centralized authoritarian state. It certainly is a state that serves in the oligarchs of Russia, and it certainly has pillaged the Russian economy and so on and so on. But the American state's done worse.
Let me just say, it's a long discussion, but it's a fascist state if you're gay. It's a fascist state if you're a journalist. This is a government that murders its opponents.
Well, the American state is a fascist state if you're black and living in Baltimore.
No, let me just say I don't think that's true. There is some due process here that is considerable.
Well, actually, no, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Read the DOJ. Hold on. Read the Department of Justice report about the Baltimore Police Department and tell me there's due process in Baltimore.
No, I can't tell you there's due process in Baltimore, but I can tell you there's due process in thousands of communities in America, and there isn't here. I can tell you that these are real problems, but I really do think, Paul, when you close your eyes to murdering your opponents, to taking over all of the instruments of public information, to taking over the banks, this is what is fascism? It's a merger of the economic and political sectors. It is the identification of a dangerous foreign other. In their case, it's us. It is using violence against your opponents. It is the aggrandizement of a leader. It is the propagandization of all civic discourse. I see all of that happening there. I see it starting to happen here, and it breaks my heart. And I don't think I'm insensitive to the enormous flaws of our own democracy, which has become this, pay-to-play paradise for the rich. But I do, when you say, are there things to oppose in Russia? Yes. Should we be opposing them militarily? Wrong way. Doesn't work. Only causes more trouble. But is there a real problem there? Do I feel comfortable with the government of Russia, with Putin? Not even close. Not even close. And I'll say one other thing. There are things that we have. I've watched reckless American politicians in both parties exaggerate. I want to underscore one thing you said that I agree with. I look at the Crimean situation. It was much more complicated. I look at the Ukraine. They ought to be able to have a referenda in both sections, and probably the eastern section should go to Russia, and the other section should be able to be in its own. But all those former satellite countries, they ought to get self-determination. I believe in that everywhere. I believe in that in Scotland. I believe it in Staten Island, and I certainly believe it in the Ukraine. And so when I see countries robbing other countries of self-determination, taking over political power through force of arms, I oppose it everywhere. I've opposed it every time we've done it, and I oppose it when they do it.
So let's go back to my main argument, which is the Democratic Party, by making the fundamental focus what I call the demonization of Russia. And as again, much of the critique of the Russian state is correct, but frankly, that's up to the Russian people to deal with, not here, especially when the United States has so much blood on its hands. The Russian people will reckon with Putin, and it's up to them to do it. But in terms of what's affecting the rest of the world, U.S. foreign policy is certainly causing far more damage around the world than the Russians are, even given the Russian support for Assad, which is another debate. But my main argument is the Democratic Party, with the exception of the Sanders wing, and although he's participating a little bit, but the Chuck Schumer wing, if you want, the Clinton-esque Chuck Schumer wing, is so focused on this issue of Russia, 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 and trying to use all the Cold War imagery and Cold War nightmares deep in American psyche. They're avoiding what's happening with what is the most existential threat to the United States, which is climate change, which they barely talk about.
There's one part of what you just said that I disagree with, and that is that I don't hear, every time they say Russia, I don't hear Cold War nightmare rhetoric. That's not what I hear. This is a different Russia. This is a different moment. They're doing it for different reasons. Now, why are they doing it? I would say the first is that you have the same establishment corrupted by money today that you had the day we lost the election. Before this election, every journalist wrote, and most politicians thought, that whoever lost the election, there would be a great civil war in that party over first premises and core values, a tremendous debate that might last years. And an uprising against discredited leadership. In the case of the Democratic Party, a leadership that lost the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the White House, and 2/3 of the governorships and even more of the state legislatures, reaching an absolute low point in its influence in the modern history of the country. And so here we are. And what happened? Most of our leaders got elected by a voice vote. The Clinton-Obama faction kept control of the DNC. And the debate we're all waiting for, it hasn't even begun. It's 7 months later, and there's nothing happening out there that would indicate that that the leaders of this party are engaged in any kind of debate. The part of the Russia Comey fixation is simply their desire to avoid taking responsibility for what has happened. And I think one of the problems for the Democratic Party is simply this. The mistakes that are most important to own were made by people that many Democrats love. They were the mistakes of Barack Obama. They were the mistakes of Hillary Clinton. They were the decisions not to raise the minimum wage when we had the votes, or to bail out the homeowners victimized by the banks, or to enact a public option. It wasn't Republicans who defeated that. It was Democratic leaders. And each one of those, when you look at the real history of each of those issues, we had the votes in the House and Senate. We could have gone forward. The president was on the wrong side. And so I'll just stop, but those are just 3 examples, but there are countless others. And we have to stop and ask ourselves, where were we? Who do we really stand for? We want credit for being the tribune of working families in this country. And yet, as I've said before on your show, people who think you can raise money on Wall Street all day and represent working families at night are people like people who think you can smoke crack and still be a good parent. Right. There's a fundamental conflict between where the party looks for its money and what it is willing to espouse and what kinds of blueprints it's willing to adopt. And the embodiment of that, in my mind, is Chuck Schumer.
Well, that's exactly where I want to go in the next segment of the interview. because I think I'll add one other argument to why they're playing this Russia card so much. This goes back to Chuck Schumer's whole philosophy on how to win elections for the Democratic Party, which is you have to fight the perception in a section of the American population that the Democratic Party is weak. They were weak in terms of, if you read Chuck Schumer's book, Chuck Schumer's, one of his main critique of the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party didn't crack down on SDS in its rhetoric, the radical anti-war fringe as he describes it. But the whole perception that post-Vietnam the Democratic Party was weak and they had to find an issue to be strong on. And that issue in the Clinton White House, where you worked for a couple of years, was going to be law and order, crime, and welfare reform, that the Democratic Party was going to show it could be even tougher than the Republicans. And I think that's what they're trying to do now on the Russia issue. Chuck Schumer's got a thing where we can be even tougher on the Russians than the Republicans because we can make Trump look weak on this. So anyway, in the next segment of our interview...
I agree with that, by the way.
Okay, well, in the next segment of our interview, we're going to talk about Bill's history because was actually ran for office. He had won was a state senator in Connecticut at 26 years old. So he's been fighting within the Democratic Party for quite a long time. And we're going to talk about his time in the Clinton White House. So please join us for part 2 on Reality Asserts Itself with Bill Curry.